Okay. Also, today should be the last class that we have over Zoom. I'm going to get tested, and assuming I test negative for COVID, then we're going to go back to in-person classes next week. Watch your Canvas emails. I recommend that you, throughout the semester, that you regularly check your Canvas emails in case things like this pop up. If I have to change anything again, if we are going to go back to Zoom again next week, I will send you an email through Canvas. If you don't hear from me between now and Monday, then that means we're going to be in person in class. Okay, so assume we're going to be in person unless you hear from me via Canvas. Okay, before we get started then with today's lecture, let's have a Top Hat quiz. So open your Top Hat account. And this is going to be quiz number 2. So give you guys a second to get into your account. And let's begin. Question 1. Recall, by the way, that if you're having technical problems, if you cannot answer Top Hat the normal way through the app or through your laptop, you can always text your responses to this phone number. The phone number is always the same. Just make sure that you enter the right code. The code changes for every question. So you text 2123, then A, B, C, or D to this phone number if you want to do that. Okay, so if all else fails, you can always text your responses. Make sure you do that. Okay, so question 1. People tend to use the availability heuristic, which states that people tend to judge the likelihood of an event based on what? A, how much the event resembles a typical event. B, how easily instances of the event come to mind. C, our prior opinions of and experiences with the event. Or D, an illusory correlation. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay. So we talked about the availability heuristic, which is when we have to estimate the frequency or the likelihood of something happening. We try to think of examples of that thing happening. And if we can easily think of examples, then we think it happens a lot, which makes the correct answer option B. Question 2. Maria and Mike are dating. When Mike gets angry with Maria, Maria attributes it to Mike being a naturally angry person. But when Maria gets angry with Mike, she attributes it to having had a bad day at work. Maria is exhibiting which of the following biases? Is it the fundamental attribution error, the confirmation bias, the actor-observer effect, or the overjustification effect? Yeah, if for whatever reason you are missing the questions popping up, you should be able to see it on your screen with the screen that I'm sharing with you. And so you can always text your responses. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so there are 2 answers that people tend to give here. Yeah, those are the 2. Fundamental attribution error and the actor-observer effect. People sometimes get confused between those 2. The correct answer here is C, the actor-observer effect. Okay, just to refresh your memory on the difference between the two, okay? The fundamental attribution error says that when we are explaining someone else's behavior, we tend to ignore how the situation might have affected their behavior, and we tend to overemphasize that internal characteristics or the internal causes of other people's behavior, okay? The fundamental attribution error is only about how we make attributions about other people. That's it. In this specific case, Maria is making an attribution about Mike and an attribution about her, okay? This is going to be the actor-observer effect. The actor-observer effect says that we make internal attributions for other people, but we make external attributions for ourselves. That's what she's doing here. She's saying when Mike gets angry, it's because he's an angry person, it's his personality. When I get angry, it's because I had a bad day at work. It's something about the situation. That's why it's the actor-observer effect. Okay, people get confused between those two a little bit. If you're having problems with Top Hat, talk to me at the end of class and I can fix them. Okay? Okay, question 3. So imagine you watch a commercial of LeBron James, NBA player, endorsing a new basketball sneaker. Although you know that James was paid to endorse the sneakers and didn't even write the endorsement himself, you still think that James really likes the new sneakers. This illustrates which of the following effects. Is it the confirmation bias, the fundamental attribution error, the actor-observer effect, or the over-justification effect? And one more time, again, if you're having problems with your Top Hat, just text your responses to this phone number. Okay, so as long as you can see my screen, you can answer Top Hat. You don't need to get into the Top Hat app. Just text your responses using this code and this phone number. Okay, you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, my 2 o'clock class did not answer this well. Let's just see how you guys did. Okay, yeah, you guys are kind of the same. So B is correct, the fundamental attribution error. But people are a little all over the place on this one, apparently. So let me explain why. Again, the fundamental attribution error says that when we're explaining someone else's behavior, we over-attribute their behavior to personality and under-attribute it to the situation. So let's think about this. LeBron James is talking about how great this basketball sneaker is, and we've got to make an attribution for why he's making these claims. Is he making the claims because he truly likes the sneakers, or is he making the claims because there's something in the situation that's leading him to make those claims? Like, for instance, he's getting paid to make those claims. If we assume that the reason he's making those claims is because of his personality, and we neglect how the situation might have affected his behavior, in other words, we neglect to consider how him getting paid to make those claims might lead him to endorse those sneakers, then we're focusing only on the dispositional, the internal causes of their behavior, right? That's the fundamental attribution error, ignoring how the situation might have affected their behavior and assuming it must reflect an internal cause. Okay, that's why this is the fundamental attribution error. Okay, just about the refund for Top Hat, just because someone's asking about this in the chat. If you are part of the book pack, the FIU book pack, and you paid an account out of pocket, you will be getting a refund from Top Hat. At the last exam, I had you give your name to a student who was there. And if you gave your name to that student saying that you were part of Backpack and you paid out of pocket for an account, I forwarded those names to Top Hat. They're processing those refunds as we speak. Okay, next question. According to the overjustification effect, people will tend to lose intrinsic motivation for a behavior if they what? A, start to get paid for the behavior, B, receive a surprise gift for the behavior, C, stop getting paid for the behavior, or D, see someone else receive a surprise gift for the behavior. You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, let's see who guys responded. So A is the correct answer. People usually respond either A or C for this one. So according to the overjustification effect, if we have initially intrinsically enjoyed doing something, and then we start to get paid for it, we start to think the only reason we're doing it is for the money. Okay, so as soon as we start to get paid for the behavior, that's when this kicks in, where we start to think we're doing it only for the money. So we immediately start to lose our intrinsic motivation. Some people respond C, that you lose intrinsic motivation only when you stop getting paid for the behavior. That's not true. You only see it when you stop getting paid for the behavior. So in other words, if I really like to paint and I start getting paid to paint, I'll still paint a lot because I'm getting paid for it. As soon as I stop getting paid to paint, suddenly you won't see me paint very much because I've assumed that I'm only painting for the external reward. But that's not because that's the moment at which I lose intrinsic motivation. I've already lost it as soon as I start getting paid for it. You just don't see it until you stop getting paid for it. So A is the correct answer. As soon as you start to get paid for it, that's when we start to lose our intrinsic motivation. Anyone who's having top hat issues, just wait till the end of the class, then talk to me. I can't handle them all now. So talk to me at the end of class and I'll take care of it. Finally, question 5. Which of the following is not a general theme that can be extracted from the findings we've discussed in social psychology so far? A, people's fundamental motivation is to obtain accurate information about themselves and others. B, people are often not aware of the causes of their behaviors and decisions. C, people don't like to think very much and will often use mental shortcuts to make various decisions. Or D, people are highly motivated to see themselves in a positive light. You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so 3 of these are themes that we've seen pop up again and again in class. One is not. The one that is not is A, that people's fundamental motivation is to obtain accurate information about ourselves. We can be motivated to obtain accurate information about ourselves, but generally speaking, we're motivated to find self-enhancing information. We really like information that makes us feel good, that shows us in a positive light, okay? We've also seen how people don't like to think very much. That's why we rely on heuristics. We saw that with in social cognition. And we saw that people aren't often aware of the causes of their behaviors or decisions. We saw that when we talked about the lack of introspection. Okay. And I'm seeing a question, is there a way to reverse the overjustification effect, but simply resuming the activity without payment undo the effects? That's an interesting question. I imagine there is. I'm not familiar with research that's looked at this, although it's possible they've done some, I'm not familiar with it. I imagine you could reverse it, although it might take a little bit of time, because once someone believes that the only reason they're doing an activity for money, you now have to sort of reprogram them to believe that there's an intrinsic interest in that activity. There might be a way to undo it. I'm just not sure if there's research on that or not. It's a good question though. Okay, so we are going to start a new topic. Now that we finished with social cognition and attributions, we're going to start talking about attitudes. And social psychologists place a lot of importance on the study of attitudes for a couple of reasons. Primarily because, if you recall, one of the main goals that social psychologists have is to be able to predict behavior, right? And the most obvious way we have of predicting behavior is to know what people's attitudes are. So for instance, if you want to be able to predict if someone's going to buy Coke or Pepsi when they go to the store, one way to do that is to know what people's attitudes are towards Coke and towards Pepsi. And presumably, if people have a strong positive attitude towards Pepsi, they're more likely to buy Pepsi at the store, right? So clearly, if we want to predict behavior, then maybe the best way, intuitively, the best way we have of being able to do so is to know what people's attitudes are. So we need to understand how people develop attitudes, and we need to understand the relationship between attitudes and people's behavior. We are going to see next class that relationship between attitudes and behavior is not as obvious as it might first appear. Social psychologists have a number of ways of defining attitudes. There have been like dozens of different definitions that social psychologists have used to define attitudes. One of the more common ones is this one here, that it's a predisposition to respond favorably or unfavorably to some object or idea. And there are a couple key components of this definition. First off is that attitudes are valenced. What I mean by that is they can be positive or negative, right? So we can respond favorably or unfavorably. You like Pepsi, you don't like Pepsi. Clearly, there's a directionality to attitudes that they can be either positive or negative. Okay? Secondly, is that although we tend to think of attitudes as mainly just, what do we like or dislike, or that affective emotional component we have towards something, there's also a behavioral component to attitudes as well, as we're going to see. And that's captured in this definition, because the definition states that it's a predisposition to respond favorably or unfavorably. Respond means there's a behavior involved, right? So if you like Pepsi, if you enjoy drinking Pepsi, then you have a predisposition to respond favorably towards that product, meaning you're more likely to actually drink Pepsi, right? So there's a behavioral component that's embedded within this definition of attitudes. Attitudes can be either explicit or implicit. What that means is an explicit attitude is an attitude that you're aware of having. So if in other words, whether you like Pepsi or dislike Pepsi, right? You're aware of that. That's an explicit attitude. It turns out that we can also have implicit attitudes, which are attitudes that we're not even aware of having, but that can lead us to respond favorably or unfavorably towards some object, but we're not even aware of having those attitudes. For this lecture today and next class, we are just going to focus on the explicit attitudes. Later on in the semester, we are going to talk about implicit attitudes in particular as they relate to things like stereotyping and prejudice. We're going to see that we all tend to have certain implicit attitudes that lead us to behave towards different people differently. But for now, we're going to focus on the explicit attitudes that we are aware of having. So if you recall, when we talked about the section of the self, we looked at the ABCs of the self, right? And that stood for the affective, behavioral, and cognitive components of the self. And we can do the same thing with attitudes as well. We can focus on those same ABCs. So for instance, the affective component of an attitude is the emotional reaction you have to some sort of object or idea. So if you drink Pepsi and you enjoy drinking Pepsi, That's the affective component of the attitude. This is the part of the attitude we're most familiar with. This is what we normally think of when we think of attitudes, is this affective component. But it's not the only component of attitudes. Attitudes are actually formed of other components as well. I already alluded to this when I mentioned that there's a behavioral component of attitudes as well, meaning that's where the predisposition to respond favorably or unfavorably to something that I mentioned in the definition, right? So not only do you enjoy drinking Pepsi, but you're more likely to drink it or to buy it when you go to the store, right? There's a behavior that goes along with that affective component of your attitudes. And C stands for the cognitive component of attitudes. The cognitive component refers to the thoughts, the beliefs, the cognitions that you have about why you have the attitude that you do. So if you like Pepsi, if you have a positive attitude towards Pepsi, you have certain beliefs about why you like Pepsi, because it's sweeter than other drinks or because of the carbonation or whatever it is, right? Now, those beliefs could be wrong. We saw before in the section on the self, when we looked at introspection, that oftentimes we're not aware of the real reasons why we like something. But regardless, whatever your beliefs are for why you think you like that thing, that forms the cognitive component of attitudes. So just to give you another example, if you think about, let's say, a dating partner, the affective component of your attitude towards your partner might be something like you enjoy being around them, you like being with them. The behavioral component of that attitude is that you spend a lot of time with your partner. And the cognitive component would be all the beliefs that you have for why you like your partner. You like them because they're warm and caring and funny and et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So you can see again that an attitude is comprised of all three of these components, or at least many psychologists believe that to be the case. However, some social psychologists have pointed out that not all of these components are necessary for an attitude. And there are certain situations in which we can show that one of these components is missing. And to give you an example of this, I want to give you a couple hypothetical scenarios on the next couple slides. And I'm going to ask you your opinion of these scenarios, okay? And you can write your opinion in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat so I can see what your opinion is on this, okay? So you don't have to write anything down for the next couple of slides, but just think about the following scenario. Okay, imagine Julie and Mark, who are brother and sister. They are traveling together in France on summer vacation from college. One night, they're staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark used the condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy it, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret, which makes them feel even closer to each other. So my question to you is, what do you think about that? Is it okay for Julie and Mark, brother and sister, to have slept together? Okay, so lots of no's. No one's saying yes at all, huh? Pretty unanimous, right? Okay, so if you said no, then why? Why is it not okay? Give me some reasons. They're siblings, yeah, but why is it wrong for siblings to sleep with one another? Yeah, they're related, but why is it wrong for related people to sleep together? What's the problem? Okay, incest. So keep in mind that we're talking about two consenting adults as well, right? They're both over 18, they're both consenting. It's not socially accepted. Okay, fine, but that doesn't matter because no one else in society is ever going to hear about this, right? They're keeping it as a special secret. So the society is not going to hear about this, right? So no one will ever know. Okay, so genetic issues could arise, health issues. So I assume what you mean is if they have a child or something, they'll have disabilities, right? So it's a good thing then that Julie is taking birth control pills and Mark is using a condom. So they're not going to have kids. If you want to go a step farther, you can imagine that they're sterile. So there's zero chance of them ever having kids. So if that's the reason why you think this is wrong, and that reason doesn't apply in this specific case, then you should be okay with it, right? So are you okay with it now? So still no. Okay, so that wasn't the real, if you're saying still no, then that wasn't really the reason why you weren't okay with it, right? So why not? Why are you not okay with it? Now, obviously, I don't think you guys are going to be okay with it yourselves, but are you okay with these two hypothetical people doing it? Okay, all right. So I'm getting a few people maybe thinking that maybe it's okay. Okay, so maybe we're taught that we shouldn't be doing it, right? But so what? What does that matter? I mean, is anyone being harmed here? If we have two consenting adults, I don't see any harm in it, right? Is there any harm? And if there's no harm, could we say that maybe it's okay? Okay, so there could be power dynamics. That's a good point. So we'd have to make sure they're sort of equal, they're not putting pressure on one another. We're assuming this is purely, completely consensual. Some people still say no, though, right? Okay, well, how about this? How about this? Let's do another hypothetical scenario. Okay. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard that dog meat was delicious, so they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. So, was it okay for them to eat the dog? Okay, lots of no's here. Maybe a couple okays. Okay, and again, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you're saying no, then why not? Okay, so dog, you might consider a dog a family member. You might, but apparently they didn't consider it the same way. Disrespectful. But what about, let's say, let's say a farmer has cows and has cows for years, and then slaughters the cow and eats the cow. Is that disrespectful to the cow? And if not, then what's the difference between a cow and a dog? Okay, so a cow is food, a dog is a friend. But I mean, is that just a cultural thing? I mean, cows aren't food everywhere in the world. Cows are considered pretty holy in some areas of the world. Now, the reason I ask these questions is because they demonstrate a couple of things. Okay. First off, I think the normal way we have of thinking about sort of our morals and our ethics is that we have reasons for why something's right or wrong, and we develop our attitude about whether it's right or wrong based on those reasons, right? And I think that one thing that these hypotheticals show is that's not really how our morals often form. Rather, what tends to happen is that we develop a moral attitude towards something, and once we have that attitude, we then search for reasons to justify that attitude we have, right? And so what that means is that if you believe that Julie and Mark should not have slept together, then we look for reasons why. And we come up with reasons like the baby's going to be deformed or something. But if you really base that moral attitude on that belief that because the baby's going to be deformed, that's why it's wrong, well, then when I take away that possibility in the hypothetical scenario because they're sterile, they can't have kids, then you should tend to think that it's right, but you probably still didn't, right? So in other words, the reason that you thought was the basis for your moral judgment was not really the basis of your moral judgment. It was rather you kind of made up a reason after the fact to justify that belief, right? So that's one thing. But the second thing it shows, maybe that's most relevant to what we're talking about now, is that you can still have these emotional reactions to something, right? You can still feel like something's right or wrong, even if you lack that cognitive aspect, even if you can't really generate a reason as to why it's right or wrong. And these hypothetical scenarios have been used in social psychology studies, and people react like you guys do. Their gut reaction is that both of these scenarios, there's something wrong about them, but people struggle to come up with reasons in these specific scenarios as to why those things are wrong. Okay, so you can still have an attitude even though you're lacking that cognitive component potentially. So natural question then is, how do social psychologists measure people's attitudes? And the primary way by far by which they measure attitudes, the simplest way, is just by asking people, just by getting a self-report. And you can do that by asking people, like, rate on a scale from 1 to 7, from highly disagree or from highly dislike to highly like, or something along those lines, your attitudes towards a number of objects, right? So you can have people self-report that. That's usually how psychologists do it. That only gets you so far. We've seen before that people have problems with introspection. They often know what their attitudes are, but they don't know the cognitive processes that got them there, right? So we might be able to get people's attitudes with self-report, but we can't really get at the reasons why, because of the problems with introspection. Psychologists have used other mechanisms, so other ways of getting at people's attitudes, especially because there are certain attitudes people have that they may not be willing to admit to if they're not socially acceptable or something. So they've tried some other ways as well. So for instance, they've tried to assess people's attitudes using their physiological responses. There's a couple of ways you can do this. So one way is to use what's known as an electromyograph, where basically you hook electrodes up to people's muscles on their face, and then you could show them images or something of various things. And when we are shown certain images that evoke a certain reaction, we often will naturally create a certain face, right? So if you're shown something really disgusting, there's a disgust reaction that you have that you can see on people's faces. And so this EMG, electromyograph, can pick up on the facial musculature, and it can assess, or it can try to determine what your attitudes are based on how your muscles are contorted in your face. Another way of doing this is with an electroencephalograph, or an EEG, where you put electrodes to measure brain activity. And the idea being that certain different types of brain activity might be associated with different types of emotions. So if you know what someone's brain activity is, you can figure out what emotion they're experiencing. And both of those methods, EMG, EEG, they're only partially successful. They can often tell if people have a positive or negative attitude towards something, but they can't really differentiate between finer distinctions than that a lot of the time. Okay, so we can sort of get at people's attitudes that way, but they're not really a fine-tuned method of doing so. A third way that psychologists have of measuring attitudes is by using covert measures. Covert measures are measures that people aren't even aware that their attitudes are being measured while they're taking whatever test it is that they're taking. Okay, so they're covert in the sense that they're hidden. And the most popular of these is something known as the implicit association test. I'm not going to get into the implicit association test because I'm going to have you guys actually take an implicit association test later on in the semester as part of an assignment. So we're going to talk about what the IAT does and what it shows and how it shows that later on in the semester. Okay, so just know that there are measures that we have to measure people's attitudes covertly, but we'll talk about the IAT later on in the course. How do we come to form attitudes over time then? And there are a number of mechanisms that we have to form an attitude. And there are a number of ways, for instance, that we can form attitudes through various learning processes. And you might be familiar with some of these learning processes through intro psychology classes, or through developmental psych classes, or behavior analysis, or something along those lines. So you might be familiar with some of these terms already, but just in case you're not, I will walk you through them. And there's a number of different ways that we can learn to develop attitudes. So the first way that we have is through a process known as classical conditioning. Classical conditioning occurs when you are exposed to something that normally doesn't produce a reaction. Okay, but if every time you're exposed to that thing, it is paired with another thing that does produce a reaction, then eventually you learn to associate this initially neutral object with that emotional reaction. And this is very abstract. So let me put this to you with an example. Okay, so and I'm going to use an example, a classic example that you might be familiar with from a developmental psych class or something. And this is the example of little Albert. And this is little Albert, his little baby here. And what the researchers wanted to know was whether they could create an attitude in little Albert that didn't exist before. So what they did is they showed little Albert this white rat. Now you can see in the picture that there's a bunny there. I'll get to that in a minute. But what they did, they first showed him a white rat. And little Albert, when he saw the white rat, would reach out and touch it and pet it, and things like that. He was not scared of it, in other words. But what would happen is that the researcher would stand behind little Albert. And after they've established that little Albert liked this rat, then the next time that little Albert would reach out and touch the rat, the experimenter would hit this metal bar with a hammer right behind his head. And that would automatically create the startle response in little Albert. He'd get scared and he'd start crying. Okay. And so every time from then on that little Albert would reach out to touch the rat, this noise, this startling noise, scary noise would go off behind his head and little Albert would cry. And you can imagine that what's going to happen is that it's not going to take too long before little Albert learns that whenever that rat is around, he's going to get scared. And so what's going to happen is that that rat is now going to produce that scared response. It's going to lead little Albert to start crying, even if it's not being paired with that scary noise anymore. And that's exactly what happened. So after a while, every time little Albert saw that white rat, he would immediately start crying even before any noise went off. He had learned to associate that rat with that scary noise. And that's what classical conditioning is. In fact, little Albert had generalized this. So what he had learned is that anything fuzzy is scary. And so he started to cry whenever a rabbit was placed on his lap, as you can see in this picture. He would start to cry if there was someone wearing like a Santa mask, and that beard, that fuzzy beard, that would be enough to get him to cry as well. So little Albert had learned to cry or to be scared, to develop a negative attitude towards anything that was fuzzy, right? Anything like a rat. Incidentally, I think, and it was kind of diabolical a little bit, it's a little bit evil, because I think if I recall correctly, they did not get rid of that phobia once they'd created it. Like ethically speaking, the researchers should have gotten rid of that phobia so little Albert wasn't scared of anything fuzzy from then on, but they didn't. And I think that when they let him go, they lost track of him, and I don't think they ever knew what happened to him. So I don't know if he developed or he maintained that phobia throughout his life or not. But at least for some time, he had developed this negative attitude towards fuzzy things. Okay, so that's one way that we can learn to develop an attitude. A second way we can learn to develop attitudes is through a process known as operant conditioning. And operant conditioning occurs whenever you are rewarded or punished for a behavior. So, for instance, if in this class, every time you raised your hand to ask a question, I paid you $5, you're rewarded for it, then what's going to happen is, like, very, very soon, you're going to be raising your hand all the time, constantly, right? You being rewarded for that behavior increases your likelihood of performing that behavior. And on the other hand, if every time you raised your hand in class, I shocked you with an electric shock, you're going to learn very quickly to never raise your hand. So being punished for behavior decreases your likelihood of performing that behavior. And that's what operant conditioning is. It's how we change our behavior as we learn to avoid punishments and to be rewarded. And so you can imagine that as far as this is concerned for attitudes, if you have a child who expresses an attitude that his parents approve of, and his parents praise him whenever he expresses that attitude, then he's learned to express that attitude. And if, on the other hand, he expresses an attitude that his parents don't like and punish him for it, he's going to learn to not express that attitude. And over time, that child can internalize those attitudes, right? Because they've been rewarded or punished for them in the past. So are we talking about negative, positive reinforcement and punishment? That's exactly what we're talking about. Now, I'm not talking about anything to do with negative, positive, because that's something different. This is very confusing to students, because I think a lot of people think that negative and positive in that context means like good or bad, and that's not what it means. It means the presence or absence of something, and I don't want to confuse people with this anymore. So I'm just saying, if you're rewarded for a behavior, that increases its likelihood. If you're punished for a behavior, it decreases its likelihood. And there was a time in psychology where psychologists believed mostly that the way that we develop attitudes, or our behavior in general, is almost purely a function of those types of learning processes, like classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And it was only later, like in the 70s or so, that psychologists started to realize that there are other ways that we can learn as well, like through a process known as observational learning. And according to observational learning, we can learn a behavior even if we're not directly rewarded or punished for it, but simply by watching someone else. And so, for instance, a child who observes their parent expressing certain attitudes can come to learn to express those attitudes themselves, even if they themselves have not been rewarded or punished for them. This is going to be particularly important when we look at aggression later on this semester, because we're going to see that people can learn aggression simply by watching others engage in aggression themselves, even if they themselves are not rewarded or punished for engaging in aggression. This is going to become important later on. So we can develop attitudes through these various learning processes, but there are other ways to develop these attitudes as well. And yes, the Bobo-Doll study is exactly what I'm talking about. We're going to talk about that later on in the semester. So we can learn to develop attitudes through a process of social comparison. Remember that social comparison theory says that we learn about ourselves in part by comparing ourselves with other people. And the same process can lead us to develop certain types of attitudes as well. So I'm going to describe to you the Bennington College study, which tended to demonstrate this. I'm just saying comparing ourselves to others, trying to find what is normal behavior. Now, I'm not quite sure exactly what you mean by that, but sort of, we can compare ourselves, or we can learn to develop attitudes through a process where we compare ourselves to other people, and our sort of partly our desire to fit in, and partly in the way that we define ourselves can lead us to change our attitudes. So let me tell you what I mean here. So Bennington College was a private all-women's college. This was back in the, I believe is the 1930s. Okay, so we're talking about a while ago. This is post the Great Depression. So again, a lot of people don't have a lot of money because we went through the biggest depression in history. And so the people that could afford to send their daughters to this private women's college tended to be wealthier families, and wealthier families tended to be more Republican, okay? So these women, when they initially arrived at Bennington College, tended to themselves be Republicans because they grew up in a family tended to grow up in families that were Republican. But when they got to Bennington College, the faculty and the upperclassmen at Bennington College tended to be much more liberal. And so what you've done is you've taken a woman who has grown up, her social comparison group has been primarily Republicans, and now she goes to a college where her social comparison group changes. They're mostly Democrats. And some researchers wanted to see whether just by changing people's social comparison targets, the people that they socially compared to, whether that would change the women's attitudes as well. So they looked at the percentage of women who voted for the Republican in the presidential election, Alf Landon. And what they showed is that among the freshmen who initially got to school, the majority of them tended to vote Republican because, again, they mostly came from Republican-leaning families. But what happened is that when you look at sophomores, that number dropped off pretty significantly to only 43% of people now supporting the Republican. And if you look at the juniors and seniors, those women, only about 15% of them supported the Republican. Okay, so what these authors are saying, again, is that when these women get to Bennington College, they start defining themselves in terms of the faculty of the upperclassmen, and they start taking on some of the attitudes that they're seeing in the faculty and the upperclassmen. Okay, and what the researchers did is they followed up with these women over the course of the rest of their lives. And these women, the political changes they went through at Bennington College tended to persist over the course of a lifetime. They didn't revert back to being Republicans, a lot of them, after they left Bennington College. They tended to stay Democratic. They tended to marry Democratic men, et cetera, et cetera. There are also genetic factors that are associated with the development of attitudes. And we know this from a couple different types of studies, but one of the more famous ones are known as twin studies. And what the researchers can look at, they look at identical twins who were born and then raised in completely different families. And they compare them to fraternal twins who were born and were raised in completely different families. Now, the only difference between identical and fraternal twins is that identical twins, that happens when a fertilized egg splits. So they basically share all of their DNA, okay? Fraternal twins occurs when two different eggs are fertilized. So fraternal twins are no more genetically similar to each other than regular brothers and sisters are, okay? So what they do is they find these pairs of twins and who have never met each other, did not grow up in the same house, did not grow up in the same city. And they give them each questionnaires assessing their attitudes. And when they compare them, what they find is that identical twins tend to be highly similar to each other. more similar to each other than fraternal twins are. And that's despite the fact that these identical twins, again, they've never even met each other, but they're still remarkably similar. And so the question is, well, why are identical twins more similar to each other than fraternal twins if they were all born apart and they never met each other? And the only answer we have for that is because identical twins share all of their DNA, whereas fraternal twins don't. So that suggests that there's a genetic component to these sorts of attitudes. Now, that doesn't mean that there's a gene for instance, being Republican or Democrat, right? That's not something that's encoded in our genes. But there might be a gene that leads people to be more likely to take risks or to be more cautious. And those personality characteristics can in turn be associated with things like political ideology. People who are more prone to risk-taking are going to be more left-leaning Democratic. People who are more cautious are going to tend to be more right-leaning or Republican. Okay. None of this means, of course, that you are born with a certain political ideology that can never change, or that you're born with certain attitudes. This isn't deterministic. There are very complex interactions between genes and environment that tend to produce your attitudes. But it does suggest there is a genetic component to these attitudes. And this is somewhat controversial. It's not really controversial that attitudes have a genetic component, I don't think. It's a little more controversial the extent to which genetics can explain our attitudes. But that's like a whole other conversation that we just don't have time to get into at the moment. So although we know that there is a genetic component to attitudes, it's controversial sometimes in terms of the interpretation of exactly what that means. Okay, so is Laura here in the class? Oh, there she is. Okay, so what's going to happen? So remember that last week you did part 1 of the study. If you participated in that extra credit, that was Laura's study. So I'm going to let her talk. So if you do part 2, she's going to have some instructions for you on how to do part 2. Laura, take it away.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. So like Dr. Charman just mentioned, last week in class, we had you guys do part 1 of my dissertation, which was just that online Qualtrics link. So hopefully by this time or very close to this time, you will already have received or will be receiving an email from Qualtrics with a link to the part 2 survey. The subject line should be something like Perceptions of Strangers 2 part 2, I think. And it'll just have a link in there where it directly says, click here to go to the survey. Just like last time, it'll take about 20 minutes or so to complete that part. If you haven't gotten it already, you should get it very close to the time that you submitted the part 1 survey last week. So if you did it during class, like I said, hopefully you'll have gotten part 2 already or within the next few minutes here. If you did it outside of class, like later on last Wednesday night, you'll get it a few hours from now, like later this evening. So don't panic too much. Also, you may want to check your spam folder just because it's not like an FIU email address. So sometimes it gets filtered to junk by mistake. But if for some reason, you should have received that part 2 email by now during class and you can't find it, it's not in your spam or anything, I'm going to put my email address and contact information in the chat so you can just send me an email directly. I can look to track your part 1 response and then figure out which part 2 link you should be sent, and I can send it to you manually. So I'll do that now, but otherwise go ahead and check your emails. Hopefully it's there, and then I believe we're giving you the rest of class today to just complete that part 2 survey.
That's right. So if you didn't do part 1 last week, then you're not going to be able to do part 2 now. You can still participate in Laura's study. It's called Perceptions of Strangers. That'll just count as the regular extra credit. It won't count towards exam 1 additional extra credit, but it'll still count for extra credit. If you did do part 1 last week in class, as she says, you should have an email, so check to make sure you have it. If you did it later on that evening, just make sure that you do part 2. You won't be able to do it until later on this evening. Make sure you do part 2 by tonight. Well, I guess tomorrow at the absolute latest. And the reason I'm saying that is because Laura's going to get me a list of students who participated in both parts of her study. And she's going to do that like tomorrow evening, I think, somewhere in there. And so you have to have done part 2 if you want to get credit by tomorrow evening, by the time she sends me those names. Okay, so just make sure that if you did part 1, we really want you to do part 2 because the data are kind of useless if you only do part 1. So just make sure you do the second part as well. If you complete part 2 in class right now, we're not going to do anything afterwards, so you can feel free to leave Zoom once you've completed part 2. We are going to stay on Zoom, I think. So if you do have any questions, then you can let us know in the chat. And yes, I will show the extra credit study that I posted at the beginning of class. Just give me 1 second.